In the heart of New York, where the skyline glitters like a promise and the streets hum with restless energy, lived a girl named Lila. She was 22, with a wild mane of chestnut hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. By day, she was an artist, scraping by on freelance gigs, painting murals on crumbling walls in Brooklyn or sketching strangers in Central Park. By night, she'd lose herself in the city's pulse, its honking taxis, its neon glow, its whispers of something bigger. Lila was a dreamer, the kind who'd sit on a fire escape and imagine a love so fierce it'd knock the breath out of her. But she'd never let anyone close. Not yet. She was still untouched, not out of some grand principle, but because no one had ever felt right. She lived in a cramped apartment in Queens with her parents, a place where the wallpaper peeled and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee. They were her rock, or so she thought. Her dad, a wiry man with tired eyes, used to fix cars for a living until the garage shut down. Her mom, a nervous woman who chain-smoked on the stoop, took odd jobs cleaning offices. Lila figured they were just getting by, same as her. She didn't know they were hiding something dark and heavy that'd been growing behind her back for years. It was a Tuesday when it all came crashing down. She'd come home late from a gig, paint still smudged on her jeans, when she found them sitting at the kitchen table. The lights were low and the room felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Her dad wouldn't look at her. Her mom's hands trembled as she stubbed out a cigarette. "Lila," her mom said, voice cracking, "we need to talk." She sat down, expecting some small confession. Maybe they'd missed rent again. But what came next hit her like a freight train. "We're in debt," her dad muttered, staring at the table. "Bad debt. The kind you don't walk away from." Lila frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Like, a loan?" Her mom's eyes filled with tears. "We owed money to some people, dangerous people. We couldn't pay it back. So, we made a deal." "A deal?" Lila's stomach twisted. She could feel the air getting thin, like the walls were closing in. What kind of deal? Her dad finally looked up, and the shame in his eyes made her heart sink. "They wanted something valuable," he said. "Something we could give them to wipe the slate clean." Her mom choked out a sob. "It's you, Lila. They sold you." The words didn't make sense at first. Sold her? Like she was a thing, a car, a piece of jewelry? She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, thinking it was some sick joke. But their faces told her it wasn't. "A man," her dad said, voice barely above a whisper. "A rich man. He paid off everything. All he wanted was you, and proof you're pure." Pure. The word landed like a slap. They meant she was still a virgin, something she'd never flaunted or hidden, just a quiet part of who she was, and now it was a bargaining chip. Her hands shook as she pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "You sold me," she said, her voice rising, "to some stranger? For money?" Her mom reached for her, but Lila yanked her arm away. "We had no choice," her mom pleaded. "They'd have killed us." "Killed you too, maybe." "He's not a monster, Lila. He's wealthy, powerful. He'll take care of you." "Take care of me?" Lila spat. "I'm not a pet, I'm your daughter." She stormed to her room, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Alone, she sank to the floor, her breath coming in jagged gasps. New York's lights flickered outside her window, but inside, everything she'd known had gone dark. Her family had traded her freedom for their safety, and somewhere out there, a man she'd never met was waiting to claim her. A few days after the bombshell dropped, Lila found herself walking into a sleek medical building in Manhattan. Her parents had insisted on this, a health check to prove she met the terms of the deal. She hated every second of it, the humiliation burning under her skin, but she went anyway, if only to buy time to figure a way out. The place was all glass and chrome, the kind of spot where money didn't just talk, it shouted. The receptionist barely looked up as she handed Lila a clipboard, her manicured nails clicking against the desk. "Fill this out. Dr. Hart will see you soon," she said, voice flat as the marble floor. Lila sat in the waiting room, gripping the pen so hard it nearly snapped. She scribbled her name, her age, 22, and left half the form blank. What was the point? This wasn't about her health. It was about her worth, reduced to a checkbox. Her leg bounced nervously, the sterile scent of antiseptic making her stomach churn. She wanted to bolt, to disappear into the chaos of New York and never look back, but the weight of her parents' desperation pinned her there. When her name was called, she stood on shaky legs and followed a nurse down a hall lined with framed degrees. The exam room was cold, clinical, with a padded table that looked more like a trap than a seat. She perched on it, clutching the thin paper gown they'd given her, feeling exposed even before anyone walked in. The door clicked open, and she held her breath. Julian Hart stepped inside, and the air shifted. He was 35, tall and lean, with dark hair swept back just enough to hint at carelessness. His eyes were a sharp gray, like storm clouds over the Hudson, and they locked onto her with an intensity that made her freeze. He wore a crisp white coat over a tailored shirt, every inch of him screaming control, confidence, money. "Lila," he said, glancing at the chart in his hand. His voice was low, smooth, the kind that could calm a patient or cut through a room. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He set the chart down and moved closer, his presence filling the small space. "First time here?" he asked, pulling on a pair of gloves with a snap that echoed in her ears. She swallowed hard. "Yeah," she managed, barely a whisper. He gave a small nod, like that was all he needed, and gestured for her to lie back. "Just a routine check," he said, his tone professional but not cold. "Nothing to worry about." But she was worried, terrified even, as he began the exam. His hands were steady, precise, brushing her skin with a clinical detachment that still sent a jolt through her. She stared at the ceiling, counting the tiles, trying to ignore the heat creeping up her neck. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, was it? This wasn't just nerves. It was something else, something she couldn't name. His fingers pressed lightly, checking whatever he needed to check, and she caught the faintest hitch in his breath. Or maybe she imagined it. "Everything looks fine," he said after a few minutes that felt like hours, stepping back to peel off the gloves. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a split second they weren't just a doctor's eyes. They were searching, piercing, like he'd seen something in her he hadn't expected. "You're good to go," he added, turning to jot something on the chart. She sat up, clutching the gown tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thanks," she mumbled, sliding off the table. She didn't look back as she grabbed her clothes and ducked behind the curtain to change, but she could feel his gaze lingering, heavy and unspoken. When she emerged, he was still there, leaning against the counter, watching her with that same unreadable intensity. "Take care, Lila," he said, and the way he said her name, soft, deliberate, stuck with her. She bolted out of the room, down the hall and into the elevator, her pulse racing like she'd just run a marathon. The city swallowed her up again as she hit the street, the honk of horns and chatter of strangers drowning out the chaos in her head. She didn't know why that encounter rattled her so much. Julian Hart was just a doctor, doing his job, nothing more. But the memory of his hands, cool, firm, yet somehow electric, clung to her skin like damp paint. She shook it off, or tried to, as she weaved through the crowds. Back in his office, Julian stood alone, staring at the chart in his hands. Lila, 22. No medical history worth noting. Routine, he'd told himself. But routine didn't explain the way his pulse had jumped when he'd touched her, or the way her wide, startled eyes had burned into his memory. He tossed the chart aside, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know her, didn't need to. She was just another patient, except she wasn't. Not to him. Not anymore. And somewhere deep down, in a part of him he rarely acknowledged, he knew he'd see her again. The days after that exam room encounter dragged on like a slow bleed for Lila. She went through the motions, painting a mural in Williamsburg, dodging her parents' calls, but her mind kept circling back to Julian Hart. Those gray eyes, that steady touch. It was ridiculous, she told herself, shaking her head as she scrubbed paint off her hands in the sink. He was just a doctor, some overpaid guy in a white coat, not a knight in shining armor. She had bigger problems anyway, like the fact her life wasn't hers anymore. Her parents had gone quiet since that night at the kitchen table, but the silence wasn't peace. It was guilt, thick and suffocating, hanging over their little Queens apartment like a storm cloud. She'd catch her mom staring out the window, cigarette burning down to the filter, or her dad pacing the hall with his head in his hands. They wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't even say the guy's name. All they told her was to get ready, whatever that meant. Lila didn't ask. She didn't want to know. But ignorance couldn't shield her forever. It was a rainy Thursday when they finally cornered her again. She'd just walked in, soaked from a downpour, her boots leaving muddy prints on the linoleum. Her dad was at the table, a half-empty beer in front of him, and her mom stood by the sink, twisting a dish towel like she was strangling it. "Sit down, Lila," her dad said, voice rougher than usual. She froze, water dripping from her jacket, a bad feeling curling in her gut. "But now?" she asked, not moving. Her mom's eyes darted to the floor. "It's happening soon," she said, barely audible over the rain tapping the window. "The wedding." Lila's heart stuttered. "Wedding?" she repeated, the word tasting sour. Her dad took a swig of his beer, then set it down hard. "The guy who paid our debt. He set a date. Next week. You're meeting him at the altar." Lila laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. "You're kidding, right? You actually think I'm going to walk down some aisle for a stranger who bought me?" Her mom flinched, but her dad's jaw tightened. "You don't get it, Lila," he said. "These people we owed, they don't mess around. He paid them off, millions, just like that. We're alive because of him. You're alive because of him." "Alive?" she shot back, stepping closer. "You call this alive? You sold me like I'm livestock." Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. Her mom reached out, tears spilling over. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He's rich, successful. He'll give you a life we never could." Lila yanked away. "I don't want his life. I want mine." But her dad's next words stopped her cold. "It's done," he said. "You're going, end of story." She didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, rain drumming against the window like it was trying to break in. A wedding. A husband she didn't know, some faceless millionaire who thought he could own her because he had cash to burn. She pictured a sleazy old guy, all slick suits and leering smiles, and her stomach turned. By morning, she'd made up her mind. She'd go, but only to see who this creep was. Then she'd run. The day came faster than she wanted. Her mom dragged her to a thrift store for a cheap white dress, nothing fancy, just enough to play the part. It clung to her like a lie, the fabric scratchy against her skin. They drove her to a small church in Brooklyn, tucked between a deli and a laundromat, its steeple half lost in the gray sky. Inside, it smelled of old wood and wax, the pews mostly empty except for a handful of strangers in stiff suits. Her parents stayed by the door, avoiding her eyes as she walked down the aisle alone, her sneakers silent on the worn carpet. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it had burst. The priest mumbled something, but she barely heard him over the blood rushing in her ears. The groom stood at the altar, his back to her, broad shoulders filling out a tailored jacket. She clenched her fists, ready to bolt the second she got a chance. Then he turned, lifting the veil her mom had pinned to her hair, and the world stopped. It was Julian Hart. Those gray eyes locked onto hers, sharp and stormy, just like they'd been in that exam room. His face went pale, his jaw tightening as recognition hit him like a punch. Lila's legs wobbled, her breath catching in her throat. The doctor who'd examined her, who'd left that strange electric mark on her skin, was the man who'd bought her. "Lila?" he said, low and rough, like he couldn't believe it either. She stared at him, her mind spinning. He didn't look like a predator, not the way she'd imagined. He looked shocked, confused, almost as lost as she felt. The priest droned on, oblivious, but neither of them moved, caught in a moment that felt like it could shatter. "You?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, just held her gaze, something flickering in his eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or something deeper? Her parents shifted uncomfortably by the door, the guests murmured, but none of it mattered. The man standing in front of her wasn't just a millionaire with a twisted fantasy. He was Julian, the guy whose hands she couldn't forget, whose voice had stuck with her like a song she couldn't shake. And now he was her husband, or about to be. The priest asked if they'd take each other, and Julian's "I do" came out quiet, hesitant. Lila's lips parted, but no sound came. She was trapped, staring into those eyes. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what she'd do next. The ceremony ended in a blur. Lila barely remembered saying "I do." The words had slipped out, shaky and hollow, more out of shock than choice. Julian's hand brushed hers as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger, his touch warm but fleeting, and then it was over. No applause, no music, just the creak of the church door as they stepped outside into the gray Brooklyn afternoon. Her parents hovered near the car, muttering apologies she didn't want to hear, but Julian waved them off with a curt nod. "I'll take her from here," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his eyes. He led her to a black SUV parked across the street, opening the door for her like this was some normal date, not a twisted transaction. She climbed in, the leather cool against her thighs, and stared out the window as the city streaked by, Brooklyn fading into Manhattan's towering skyline. Neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with questions neither dared to ask. Lila's hands twisted in her lap, the cheap white dress still clinging to her like a bad dream. She stole a glance at him. His jaw was set, his fingers tight on the wheel, and wondered what he was thinking. Did he know she'd been sold? Did he care? They pulled up to a building on the Upper East Side, all glass and steel, the kind of place Lila had only ever seen from the outside. The doorman tipped his hat as Julian guided her through the lobby, past marble floors and a chandelier that dripped light like liquid gold. The elevator ride was torture. 30 floors of quiet, her pulse hammering, his cologne filling the space with something woody and sharp. When the doors opened, she stepped into his penthouse and her breath caught. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city, Central Park sprawling below like a green heartbeat. Everything screamed money. The sleek furniture, the art on the walls, the faint hum of wealth in the air. Julian tossed his keys onto a counter and turned to her, loosening his tie with one hand. "You're probably tired," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was softer now, less like the doctor she'd met, more like a man unsure of his next move. She didn't answer, just stood there, arms crossed, feeling small in the vastness of his world. He gestured down a hall. "Your room's that way. Or ours if you want it. No pressure." Her stomach flipped. "My room?" she echoed, sharper than she meant. "What is this, some kind of prison with better views?" He flinched, just barely, and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not like that," he said. "I didn't—" He stopped, like he wasn't sure how to finish. "Look, I don't know what you think of me, but I'm not here to force you into anything." "Then why am I here?" she snapped, stepping closer. "Why'd you buy me? Because that's what this is, right? My parents sold me and you wrote the check." Her voice trembled, anger and fear tangling together. Julian's eyes darkened, but he didn't look away. "I didn't plan this," he said, low and firm. "I didn't even know it was you until you walked down that aisle. I thought—" He cut himself off again, exhaling hard. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" She laughed, bitter and brittle. "You're a millionaire surgeon who paid for a virgin bride. Sounds pretty simple to me." He took a step toward her and she tensed, but he stopped short, hands raised like he was calming a wild animal. "I'm not that guy," he said. "I don't want a bride who's here against her will. I don't want— You don't have to do anything you don't want." She stared at him, trying to read the truth in those gray eyes. He sounded sincere, but she'd been burned too many times to trust easy. "Then let me go," she said, quieter now, testing him. He hesitated, and that pause was an answer. "I can't," he admitted. "Not yet. There's more to this than you know." Before she could press him, he turned and headed down the hall. "Get some rest," he called over his shoulder. "We'll talk tomorrow." She watched him disappear, then sank onto the plush couch, her head spinning. Alone, she let the day crash over her. The church, the ring, his voice saying, "I do." She hated him, hated this, but a tiny, traitorous part of her kept replaying that exam room, his hands on her, the way he'd said her name like it mattered. Hours later, she found the room he'd pointed out. A guest suite bigger than her old apartment, with a bed draped in dark silk and a view that could have been a postcard. She didn't unpack, just kicked off her sneakers and climbed under the covers, still in that damn dress. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the penthouse made her jump, half expecting him to barge in. But he didn't. Morning light woke her, spilling through the windows in golden streaks. She padded barefoot to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee. Julian was there, shirt sleeves rolled up, pouring a mug. He looked up, and for a second neither of them moved. "Sleep okay?" he asked, casual, like they were roommates, not strangers bound by a messed-up deal. She shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Not really." He slid the mug toward her, a peace offering. "Black, right?" "I guessed." She took it, the warmth seeping into her hands, and their fingers brushed, just for a moment. Her breath hitched, and she saw his eyes flicker, like he'd felt it too. "Thanks," she muttered, pulling back. He nodded, sipping his own coffee, and the silence stretched again. But then he set his mug down, stepping closer, close enough she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "Lila," he said, softer now. "I meant what I said. I'm not here to hurt you, but you're right. I owe you answers." His hand hovered near hers, not quite touching, and the air crackled between them. She didn't pull away this time, caught by the weight of his gaze, the unspoken promise in it. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple anymore. And deep down, she knew the night had changed something. For both of them. The days after that first night in the penthouse settled into an uneasy rhythm. Lila stayed, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know where else to go. Running sounded good in theory, grabbing her sketchbook and disappearing into the city, but every time she thought about it, her parents' scared faces flashed in her mind. They'd sold her to save themselves, sure, but they'd also hinted at bigger threats, shadowy figures who didn't forgive debts. She wasn't ready to test how real that danger was. Not yet. Julian gave her space, more than she'd expected. He'd leave for the hospital before dawn, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood, and come back late, tie loosened and eyes tired. They'd cross paths in the kitchen or the living room, exchanging small talk that felt like walking on glass. Careful, brittle, ready to crack. "How's your day?" he'd ask, pouring coffee. "Fine," she'd lie, sketching at the counter. But the truth was, she wasn't fine. She was a caged bird in a gilded cage, and he was the guy holding the key. Or so she thought. He didn't push her, didn't demand anything, and that threw her off. She'd braced for a controlling creep, someone who'd lock her in and throw away the key. But Julian wasn't that. He'd cook dinner sometimes, simple stuff like pasta with sauce from scratch, and leave a plate for her, no strings attached. She'd eat alone, staring out at the city lights, wondering who he really was. A surgeon who saved lives by day, a man who'd bought her by night. It didn't add up. One evening, he came home earlier than usual, his coat dusted with snow from a sudden flurry. She was sprawled on the couch, sketching the skyline, when he dropped a question out of nowhere. "Ever been on the Brooklyn Bridge at night?" She looked up, pencil pausing mid-light. "No," she said, cautious. "Why?" He shrugged, shedding his coat. "It's something else in the snow. Thought you might like it." She didn't trust him, not fully, but the idea of getting out, breathing air that wasn't his, pulled at her. "Okay," she said, grabbing her jacket. They walked mostly in silence, the city buzzing around them, snowflakes catching in her hair. On the bridge, with Manhattan glowing in the distance, he started talking, not about the deal, but about himself. "I wanted to be a painter once," he said, hands in his pockets, "before med school ate my life." She glanced at him, surprised. "You? An artist?" He smirked, a rare crack in his usual calm. "Bad one, probably, but yeah. I liked the mess of it. Colors, chaos. Surgery's the opposite. Precise, controlled." She nodded, filing that away. "Why'd you switch?" she asked. He looked out at the water, his breath fogging in the cold. "My dad died, car accident. I was 16, watched the surgeons try to save him and fail, figured I'd do better." Something softened in her then, just a little. He wasn't bragging, he was remembering, and it hurt. "Did you," she asked, "do better?" He met her eyes, steady and unguarded. "Most days, not always." They stood there, the wind whipping around them, and for the first time she saw him as more than her captor. He was a person, flawed and real, carrying scars she hadn't noticed before. Back at the penthouse, things shifted. He'd catch her sketching and linger, asking about her lines, her colors. She'd answer, short at first, then longer, letting him in inch by inch. One night she was up late, sprawled on the living room floor with charcoal smudged on her hands, working on a drawing of the bridge. Julian came home, his scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, and stopped in the doorway. "That's incredible," he said, crouching beside her. She froze, his closeness sending a shiver down her spine. "It's just a sketch," she muttered, but he shook his head. "No, it's alive. You've got something, Lila." His voice was quiet, earnest, and when he looked at her, those gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were warm, almost hungry. Her pulse kicked up, and she didn't pull away when he reached out, brushing a streak of charcoal off her cheek. His fingers lingered, rough from years of surgery but gentle against her skin, and the air turned thick. "Thanks," she whispered, barely audible. He didn't move, his hand hovering near her face, and she could feel the heat of him, the pull she'd fought since that exam room. "Lila," he said, low and raw, "I don't know how to do this, right, but I see you, more than you think." Her breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she leaned in, closing the gap. Their lips met, slow at first, tentative, like they were testing the edge of something dangerous. Then it deepened, his hand sliding to her neck, hers clutching his shirt, and it was like a dam breaking. All the tension, the anger, the confusion poured out in that kiss, fierce and messy and alive. He tasted like coffee and snow, and she felt the world tilt, her heart slamming against her ribs. When they pulled apart, breathless, his forehead rested against hers. "I didn't mean for that," he murmured, voice rough. "Me neither," she said, but she didn't let go. They stayed there, tangled on the floor, the sketch forgotten between them. She didn't know what this was. Lust, need, something more, but it was real, and it scared her. He scared her, not because he'd bought her, but because he was starting to matter. And that was a risk she hadn't signed up for. The next morning she woke up alone on the couch, a blanket draped over her. Julian was gone. A note on the counter. Early surgery, coffee's on. She traced the words with her finger, her lips still tingling from the night before. She hated how much she wanted him to come back, how much she wanted to feel that again. She was still a prisoner, still bound by her parents' deal, but now there was something else, a thread tying her to him, fragile but growing stronger, and she didn't know if she'd cut it or let it pull her closer. The kiss changed everything and nothing. Lila woke up each day with the taste of Julian still lingering, a ghost she couldn't shake. They didn't talk about it, not directly, but it hung between them like smoke. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, sparking something neither could ignore. She'd catch him watching her while she sketched, his gray eyes soft in a way that made her chest ache. He'd leave her coffee, ask about her art, and she'd answer, letting him closer, despite the voice in her head screaming to run. She was falling, and she hated herself for it. But the penthouse wasn't a fairy tale, and she wasn't free. The deal, her parents' debt, the millionaire's terms, still loomed, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Julian never brought it up, never pushed, but the ring on her finger felt heavier every day. She needed answers, needed to know why he'd done this, why he'd let it happen. So one night when he came home late, scrubs wrinkled and hair a mess, she cornered him in the kitchen. "Tell me the truth," she said, arms crossed, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Why me? Why this whole messed up deal?" He froze, a glass of water halfway to his lips, and set it down slow. "Lila," he started, but she cut him off. "No vague bullshit, Julian. I deserve to know. You bought me, or someone did. I need to hear it from you." He sighed, leaning against the counter, and for the first time he looked tired, not just from work, but from something deeper. "I didn't buy you," he said, the words sharp and sudden. She blinked, thrown. "What?" He ran a hand through his hair, eyes locking onto hers. "I didn't set this up. I didn't even know it was you until the church. My mother, she's the one who made the deal." Lila's breath caught, her mind scrambling to catch up. "Your mother?" she echoed, incredulous. He nodded, jaw tight. "She's controlling. Old money, old rules. She's been obsessed with the family name, keeping it pristine. When she heard about your parents' debt, through some shady connections, she saw an opportunity. A virgin bride for her son, someone she could mold. She paid it off, set it all up. I didn't know until it was too late." Room spun. Lila gripped the counter, her knees weak. "You're saying you had no say?" she asked, voice rising. "You just went along with it?" He stepped closer, frustration flashing in his eyes. "I tried to stop her. When I found out, after I met you in the exam room, I told her no, but she'd already signed the papers, paid the money. By the time I saw you at the altar, it was done. I couldn't undo it without putting you back in danger." "Danger?" She laughed, harsh and broken. "You think this isn't danger? I'm a pawn in your mom's game, and you're what? My jailer?" His face twisted, pain flickering across it. "I didn't want this," he said, voice low. "I didn't want you like this. But when I saw you, when we—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I couldn't let you go, not completely. I thought I could make it work." "Make it work?" she spat, tears burning her eyes. "I trusted you, Julian. I kissed you, and now you're telling me it's all a lie?" She turned, storming toward the door, grabbing her jacket. He called after her, "Lila, wait!" But she didn't stop. She hit the elevator, then the street, rain pelting her face as she ran. New York swallowed her up, cold and relentless, matching the storm inside her. Her parents had sold her. His mother had bought her, and Julian? He'd let it happen, even if he hadn't started it. The kiss, the moments she'd let herself feel, all felt like ash now. She didn't know where she was going. Queens, the bridge, anywhere but back to him. The rain soaked her through, blurring her tears, and she kept moving, one thought pounding in her head. She'd been a fool to think she could trust him. Lila ran until her lungs burned, the rain a cold slap against her skin. New York's streets blurred around her, taxis splashing through puddles, lights smearing into streaks of yellow and red. She ended up near the High Line, the old elevated park cutting through the city like a lifeline. She climbed the stairs, her sneakers slipping on wet metal, and stopped at the edge, gripping the railing. Below, the world churned on, oblivious to the mess she was in. Her jacket hung heavy, soaked through, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of it all. Julian's words echoed in her head. His mother, the deal, the lie. She'd started to feel something for him, something real, and now it was shattered. Footsteps splashed behind her, slow but deliberate. She didn't turn, but she knew it was him. Julian stopped a few feet away, his voice cutting through the rain. "Lila, please!" It was raw, pleading, not the calm doctor she'd met or the guarded man she'd kissed. She spun around, glaring at him through the downpour. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his coat drenched, but those gray eyes still pinned her in place. "I don't need your money or your name," he said, stepping closer. "I need you. I'm sorry for everything." She stood there, water streaming down her face, mixing with tears she couldn't hide. He reached for her, hesitant, but she didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't step forward. Her heart screamed two things at once: run from him or run to him. The rain kept falling, the city hummed below, and Lila stayed frozen, caught between freedom and the man who'd turned her world upside down.